All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Rada Madrigal with the California ISO, as I said earlier. I am one of the lead client trainers here at the ISO. I've been with the company for 22 years, so it's been a long time and quite the evolution. And I'm excited to share with you today our ISO market. So we're going to kind of go over how things work today, and then we're going to take a little preview into some of the exciting initiatives coming up in the future, the extended day ahead market and the day ahead market enhancements. So we'll kind of cap off a little bit later this afternoon with talking about those future initiatives. There we go. So our agenda today, as I said, first we're going to talk about the ISO market operations. So we're going to talk about how the day ahead market works, how the real-time market works, how those two work together. We're going to talk a little bit about market pricing, and we're going to go into some bidding examples. And then after that, we're going to take an overview of the upcoming market changes, as I indicated, with EDAM and DAME. Kind of the first half up there is going to take us from now until the break. And then after the break, we'll dive into some of the supplier bidding examples and the market changes. You should have a copy of the course slides there in front of you, as well as some reference material that we will send to you via email. Today, we have you for a short period of time, and so we're kind of giving you a high-level overview of how things work. The reference material that we're going to send you via email later is something that is going to be a clickable PDF that will take you to a variety of other computer-based training modules, some video recordings of emergency things that we've done in the past with the energy emergency alerts, and some links to web pages that you can kind of use to keep track of these upcoming initiatives. So Polly and the team will get that information sent out to you via email later. But let's go ahead and dive right into it. And as Stacy said when she was kicking us off, really this session here is for you to learn. So I have about 2 or so hours with you, and I have about 50 some odd slides. And that's kind of a collection of what I'm hoping to share with you today. But really, we're here for you to answer your questions. So you all have microphones there on the table. I would ask that you use the microphone to ask questions so that those who are listening to the recording later have some context for the answers that I may be giving. And so feel free to, raise your hand and speak up at any time. This is a safe space for you to learn more about how things work, and we're excited to share that with you. So to jump right into it, today's ISO market, we have both a day ahead and a real-time scope for each what we call trade date. So the day ahead market runs for tomorrow. There are a series of steps that occur. And then when the market results publish later this afternoon for tomorrow's trade date, that's when the real-time market begins and kicks off. And so if we look along the timeline here, the day ahead market opens 7 days before the trade date. And when we're talking about the trade date, from a day ahead market perspective, we're talking about tomorrow, so May 10th. The day ahead market opens 7 days before that and closes at 10 a.m. the day before. So in about 38 minutes, the market will close for tomorrow, and then we'll go through a series of processes, which I'll take you through. Once those processes complete and we publish the market results at about 1300 this afternoon, that's when the real-time market is made available, and then bids into that market that market for each individual trading hour in real time is open up until 75 minutes before the top of that hour. So that's kind of how things work from a timing perspective. And now we're going to go ahead and step through some of those processes so that you get a feel for how they work. So in the day ahead time frame, once that 10 a.m. timer hits and the market closes, and we have 3 different processes that kick off. The first is something called market power mitigation. The second is the integrated forward market. And the third is residual unit commitment. And I'm going to take you through each one of those. You may have gotten a little bit of a preview of market power if you have taken all of the modules that the Stanford team put together. But at a high level, first we're going to talk about how the market decides which resource to commit. And so if I am a resource and I'm bidding into the market, as we see on this slide here, there's 5 different types of resources. They're all offering in at the same bid price. How does the market figure out which resource to commit or select to turn on for the coming day? And it's not just the bid price that's taken into account when the market is doing its optimization. We use something called security constrained unit commitment, which those are 4 technical words, but security constrained really means respecting the constraints of the physical wholesale electric system. So each transmission line has a certain amount of capacity that can flow along it reliably. And then each generator has a certain amount of capacity or energy that they're able to generate. And so putting all of that together, we figure out the least cost way to get generation to load, respecting those physical constraints of the system. And so the market takes a look not just at the energy bid, but it actually includes 3 different elements. So we call it a 3-part energy bid. The resource has a startup cost, which is a one-time cost. How much does it cost to start up this resource? Another thing that factors in is what is the minimum load cost? So how much does it cost to keep this unit operating for that particular hour? And then those 2 items combined with this energy bid curve here, which you see everybody's offering in at $20, and their bid curve may step up in increments as the megawatts that they're offering increase. But essentially this 3-part energy bid takes a look at not just what they're bidding, but some of those fixed and or variable costs that you might have also taken a sneak peek at if you looked at that intro module from the Stanford team. So the market is analyzing the bids that are submitted from each resource, and it's also taking a look at a couple of other things. So the first thing that we do is something called market power mitigation. And you'll hear me say we a lot, and it's not a human that's doing this, so I need to always make sure I make that clear. When I say we, I'm kind of impersonating or personifying the market. So there's a market engine, a series of calculations and algorithms that are doing this work. So the market engine, the first process is called market power mitigation. Essentially, the goal here is to make sure that a resource does not have the ability to control the market price based on where they're located. So in the first image here, you see a resource. And in the second image on the right, you see multiple resources. And the goal essentially is to make sure that one resource does not have the ability to exercise market power or control the price in a specific area. So let's say I'm a generator. I'm the only generator that can serve the city of San Francisco. Technically, I could bid as high as I want, and the load would have to take that energy from me. And so the goal here is to make sure that I'm not essentially price gouging. So the market power mitigation process compares the bids that are submitted from each of the resources to other bids that are submitted and make sure that those bids are essentially being offered in competitively. So the first process that takes place is an analysis of the bids that are submitted. There isn't anything scheduled or dispatched as a result of that first process, but we might do something called mitigation, which is lowering that bid that was submitted to something called a default energy bid, which is something that had been predetermined when this resource was entering the market. So we'll talk a little bit about how that works. Essentially, yes, go ahead, question. If you, yeah, use the microphone, go ahead.
Quick question about your previous slide, you talked about minimum load cost. So would that be the cost to dispatch, say, a thermal generator at its minimum?
That's correct. So you've got a physical minimum and a physical maximum of a resource. The cost that it takes the resource to start up and run at that physical minimum or PMIN, that's the minimum load cost. Yes. So for example, a resource might have a PMIN of 10 megawatts and a maximum of, let's say, 150. So whatever it costs to get it turned on and running at that 10 megawatt level, that's the minimum load cost. And then there's also that startup cost to get it started up that's factored in. Yes. So going back to the market power here, when the market analyzes the bids that are submitted, the market will replace that bid that was submitted with either the default energy bid or the competitive LMP from the pricing run that was done, whichever one of those is higher. And the goal here is just to make sure that the bids that are being submitted into the market are all at a competitive level. And that default energy bid calculation that occurs essentially is determined by the type of resource. So we have hydro default energy bids, there's variable cost options. When you're selecting a resource for bidding into the market, you work with, or you choose which one of these default energy bid calculation options that you want, and you notify the ISO of that information by putting it into what we call the master file. The master file is essentially a large database that we have to store all of the different elements and pieces of information about each resource. So that's a little bit of a technical, kind of lower into the weeds, but the ISO has a database of all of the resources, knows all of the resource characteristics, every resource, what their minimum and maximum is. If it's a multi-stage generator, the different configurations it's set up as, what all of the costs are, the heat rate of the resource. So again, going back to those modules that the Stanford team put together when you're looking at fixed costs and variable costs, all of those little data elements are in the ISO's master file. So when the market is doing an analysis of each of the resources, it has all of the information it needs to make that appropriate decision. Before I move on from market power mitigation, does anybody have any questions on this particular process?
There we go. In the analysis, what is the trigger that says that market power mitigation is needed?
So there is.
Is it a price that's out of whack, or?
It's not necessarily, it's not just price. So what we do is, it's called a pivotal supplier test. And essentially the transmission constraints are kind of tested in, so we do a pricing run that figures out what the competitive price for all the areas would be. And then we look at certain areas where there may be transmission constraints, and we look to see if this resource here, if we removed their megawatts from the equation, would we be able to provide all of the energy needed to the demand in this area? And if so, then that one resource or collection of resources does not necessarily have market power, because we can supply the demand with other resources sufficiency. But if removing that pivotal supplier from the equation means that we don't have enough energy supply for that area, that pivotal supplier has the potential for market power. It doesn't mean that they're bidding excessively high or actually exercising it. It just means they have the potential for market power. So for those resources that have the potential for market power, we take a look at the bid that they submitted and compare that to the competitive LMP that was determined or that default energy bid. And if their bid is above those numbers, we bring it down or mitigate it to the higher of that competitive LMP or the default energy bid. So there is a price component, but essentially only if they are in a situation where they have the potential to exercise that market power. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily doing it, but that's how it works. Does that make sense? Okay.
How often does this happen in practice, that you see that a generator has market power and you need to do something about it?
I don't have that percentage off of the top of my head, but it's less and less, though those exact numbers are reported in our market reports. So we have a Department of Market Monitoring. They have both quarterly and annual reports on market issues and performance. And those exact numbers will be in that report. And so Heidi, if you wouldn't mind taking a note to send a link. I did not include that link in that resource packet that I had given to Holly earlier, but maybe that's another link that we could share with you. So I just can't remember off the top of my head what the numbers are, but they do exist and they're reported out there. And you can see that that number is available for both day ahead and real time. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to move on from market power mitigation. So that first process, the goal of that is to essentially provide to process number 2, a set of clean bids for the market engine to work with. So in the second process, which is called the integrated forward market, here we are clearing, and by we, I mean the market engine. Here the market is clearing bid in supply against bid in demand. So all of the bids from generating resources compared with all of the bids submitted by load serving entities on behalf of demand, we're clearing those two bid curves together. So we collect all of the supply bids along one curve, all of the demand bids along another curve. I'll show you a chart later where those two prices intersect. That determines how much supply clears the market for each individual trade hour of those 24 hours for the coming day. And so that's what happens in that process. And then what comes out of that are day ahead schedules and also awards for virtual bids. And I'll talk a little bit about virtual awards, but we'll keep that conversation brief because that's not activity that's occurring today in WEIM. And also in the future with EDAM, it's not necessarily something that's clicked on during the first year. But at a high level, a virtual award is for financial participation in the market that is not associated with any physical resource. Now, because we're clearing bid in supply against bid in demand, it is possible that sufficient capacity may not be committed to meet the forecast demand. So because we're comparing bids submitted by the energy providers and the load serving entities and using price as a deciding component, that means that in each hour, we will only clear enough demand as is determined to be price appropriate. In other words, if suppliers are not willing to pay as high as maybe the highest bidders are submitting their energy into, then we won't clear all of that demand in that particular hour. So we do have a third process. It's called residual unit commitment, meaning picking up other resources. And I'll talk to you about that when we get to step 3. But in the second process, we're clearing bid in supply against bid in demand, and also just for the California ISO Balancing Authority area, we're also procuring additional ancillary services awards. So ancillary services are those regulation and reserves products, spinning reserves, non-spinning reserves, regulation up and down. These are elements of a balancing area, and these ancillary services products are essentially these special products that you're able to tap into if when you get to real time you need a sudden increase in demand, or sorry, a sudden increase in supply, you already have resources available to kind of be able to tap into that. Third box on the chart here says commit resources. When you see the word commit from a market perspective, what we're meaning is essentially saying we're selecting or choosing a resource and saying that it's going to be running in tomorrow's market or on tomorrow's trade date. This chart here shows you visually how that market process works. So we've got the energy curve. Demand bids are in blue, supply bids are in green. You can see from a demand perspective, I'll add in what we call self-schedules. There's also a component in the market where a resource is able to bid in their supply and say, I'm a self-schedule, meaning I'm going to submit a bid of my megawatts and it doesn't include a price because I'm saying I'm going to accept whatever the market price is. We also have the capability for demand to do that as well. So they could say, I'm willing to purchase X number of megawatts and I'll pay whatever the market clearing price is. So we put both of those types of bids at the beginning of the economic curve because there's no price signal associated with that. And if you take a look on the chart, demand is in blue and it's at the top, and you can see that that blue line is a little bit longer than the line at the bottom for suppliers. And that's to indicate that typically we're finding that there are more self-schedules on behalf of demand, meaning folks are saying, I'm purchasing X number of megawatts, I'll pay whatever that market clearing price is. So where the location where those two price curves intersect, that is the total cleared demand for that particular hour. And that determines the market clearing price for energy for that particular trade hour. So there can be, we're talking about a day ahead perspective, there could be 24 different energy prices for each of the 24 different hours for the coming day, based on the bids that were submitted into each individual hour from all of that collection of suppliers. Any questions on this?
So in this, those who submit the demand bids, would those be the utilities themselves who are serving retail load?
Right. So demand bids would be from load serving entities or community choice aggregators, anybody who's representing the load side. Yes.
And they're obviously not going to know exactly how much load they're going to have to serve. They're going to have a good idea. So they are going to bid, they're going to demand sort of a minimum of what they know they need, and the rest they'll take care of in the real-time market. Is that how?
That kind of how they decide how much to bid kind of depends on their own particular bidding strategy. So there is not a tariff requirement that they bid X percentage of their demand. You know, according to good utility practice, you'd figure that they'd want to get all or, you know, most or all or some, you know, some sort of percentage, but there isn't a specific number given to them as a target. But essentially what they're doing is deciding whether they think, you know, how much they're trying to make a determination of, if I have a forecast of my use for the coming day, I'm going to bid in this many megawatts. And if the price is such and such given price, I'd be happy to procure, you know, all of that in the day ahead timeframe. And the difference between what they clear in the day ahead versus what they actually consume in real time, they'll pay for that delta at whatever that real time price is. So they make a determination of, you know, how much they want to procure in day ahead versus how much they're willing to kind of let it ride, say, in real time.
And if they buy too much, if they buy more than their retail customers are demanding, then they have to sell it with a bilateral contract? Or?
No, it's more when we get down to how you purchase in day ahead versus what you consume in real time. This is done after the fact when we compare the meters, and essentially if you were procuring more than you used in that particular hour, then you would essentially pay, you know, sell it back to the market at whatever that real-time price was. So there's a settlement calculation that figures out how much you used versus how much you were awarded. And if there's a difference, you know, it gets paid back at the real-time price. So there's financial unwinding of that after the fact. But they don't necessarily have to take the burden of figuring out what to do with those extra megawatts. The market handles that piece. There was a question in the back?
Yeah. Could you define what is self-schedules versus what is not self-scheduled?
Absolutely. So from a generator perspective, a self-schedule is a bid for a certain amount of megawatts with no price associated with it. So I'm essentially saying, I'm going to sell 50 megawatts in hour ending 3, and I will accept whatever that market clearing price is. And on the demand side, it's I'm willing to purchase 50 megawatts at hour ending 3, and I'll pay whatever that market clearing price ends up being. And you can also submit a combination of the two. So I could say I'm definitely running tomorrow an hour ending 3 at 50 megawatts. And if the price is to my liking, meaning whatever, price component that I indicate, then I'm willing to go from 50 to say 70 at such and such price. So I could layer the two together if I wanted to.
So, yeah. Can you explain what is the circumstances in which an LSC would be able to not be self-scheduling? Like, it seems like their demand is pretty concrete and set, and the only amount that would not be self-scheduled would be the uncertainty in their at the margin of their forecast. What is the logic there?
So a self-schedule means you're committing from the demand side. It means you're committing to purchase a certain amount of megawatts at whatever the price is. And you can also on that side layer economic bids on top of that as well. So I could, let's pretend I'm a load serving entity and I typically use 2,000 megawatts in this particular hour. I could say, well, historically, it seems like I'm always using 1,800. So I'm going to self-schedule myself for 1,800. But what if I need that extra up to 2,000? Well, I'm going to say, well, if the price is, $20, then I'm going to go ahead and pay for all of that in day ahead. And if the market clearing price ends up being higher than that, then I know that, okay, well, now I'm exposed to whatever that real-time price is going to be. And it could be higher or lower than that $20. So they kind of make that determination of how much they're wanting to guarantee with a self-schedule or how much they're willing to essentially let the price decide whether they're paying a day ahead price or the real-time price. When it comes right down to it, they're going to pay for every megawatt that they consume. The deciding factor is, am I paying for it at the price I locked in at day ahead, or am I going to pay for some of that at the real-time price? And it may be a combination of the two. Does that help?
Yeah. So in other words, they're kind of they're taking their risk and guessing what they think the market's going to do in the day ahead.
Right. So they're hedging between day ahead and real time and trying to figure out for themselves that sweet spot, if you will. And they make those determinations based on their own business practices. What you'll find here at the ISO is that we don't give any particular advice on bidding strategy on either side. So we could say, this is how they might do it, or this is how they might do it. You may get into some of the more strategy when it comes to Mark and Frank later. You'll get that element in. From me, you'll kind of get the basics of, well, this is what the market does. And then people need to make that decision on how they're going to operate based on their own, bidding practices. Any other questions?
Could you elaborate on the virtual awards or the virtual bidders, I think you called them? Why are they allowed, why are they created or allowed to participate, and how do they make a profit if they're not selling energy?
So we'll talk a little bit about the virtual bidders. There is financial participation that is allowed in the ISO market. It's essentially an element of market design. And in order to comply with, and I forgot which FERC requirement it was, but the ISO implemented virtual bidding, we call it convergence bidding, to comply with that FERC order. Any organized market that has both a day ahead and a real-time market needs to have this element to comply with that FERC requirement. So it wasn't necessarily something that we came up with on our own, but the goal or purpose of virtual bidding is to allow for financial participation in the market, which gives additional bids and more liquidity to the market, and also a possibility that some of those bids because they get put along that same supply and demand curve, some of those bids may actually end up being that supplier that sets that market clearing price. So it allows for explicit financial participation, which folks were in the past trying to do themselves by bidding in actual physical resources and then kind of trying to pull them out. So we're separating actual true physical activity from that financial activity. So that's one thing. And also, if a virtual or financial participant is in the market submitting bids, it also incentivizes those physical suppliers and demand participants to come into the day-ahead market and bid their supply and their demand to make sure that they get in and get the price that's appropriate for them. Because as I mentioned, with these suppliers, on the demand side especially, whatever they don't procure in day-ahead, they're going to be subject to at the real-time price anyway. So it's kind of incentivizing those demand participants to come in with their full participation in day ahead, so we get that kind of more robust demand curve and more accurate idea of what is going to be needed in each one of those particular hours. So there's a little bit of that financial incentives. And I think Mark wanted to jump in real fast to talk a little bit about virtual bidding. So I'll give you the floor as well if someone has a microphone.
Go and add to what Radha is saying. Well, and we'll get to try this out tomorrow, so you'll kind of experience it. But like what Radha was saying, is that the beauty of financial participation is it can make your day ahead of it's basically using the wisdom of the market to make the day ahead market look more like real time, which lets you have all the benefits that Radha was talking about before. That why we like day ahead markets is we like to be able to have, this sophisticated, market calculation that does all these optimizations for all the startup costs, the minimum load cost, all the things that Radha was talking about. So, the idea of it and why they call it convergence bidding is that by financial players entering, the idea is that the day ahead will converge because of that wisdom of the market more to what the real time will actually look like. And that's what allows you to benefit from all these optimizations. Otherwise, if you're optimizing things day ahead, but for whatever reason, the real time market looks totally different, then maybe we, would have been ready to start up a unit that actually in real time shouldn't have started. So kind of, just it's letting you, at the end of the day, hopefully reduce costs. So,
Yeah, thank you for that. The good point on the convergence. So as I mentioned, we call virtual bidding convergence bidding, and the goal the goal with that terminology is to get the day ahead price and the real time price to come closer together or converge, and that's where we get that term from. And so in the past, before this was implemented, there may have been some kind of trying to figure out whether the day ahead price would be higher or lower, and that might have fueled certain types of bidding activity. And the goal with this virtual bidding is to get the day ahead price and the real time price to be closer together, not just in that particular hour, but also the volatility of prices hour to hour is also the goal of that, is to smooth that out as well. So if a resource says, well, I'm not going to bid my capacity into day ahead, I'm just going to wait until real time because I think the price is going to be higher, they might actually be losing out because there may not be that significant price difference between the two. So that's kind of one of the goals there. Question?
What kind of party is placing virtual bids?
You have to, so anyone who participates in the ISO market needs to be a scheduling coordinator, and there are certain scheduling coordinators that are certified convergence bidders. So they could be solely a financial participant, or they could also be a physical load serving entity or physical supplier as well, who is also chosen to participate in convergence bidding. So there's certain, credit requirements, and you have to have a certain amount of collateral, and you have to be a certified scheduling coordinator. But there is no link between a physical asset and this financial activity. And so I could be solely a financial participant, or I could be a load serving entity, and I could have a fleet of resources, and I could also choose to participate in this convergence bidding activity as well. We have our pricing module, which is a link to that. Oh no, the bidding and self-schedules. There's a bidding and self-schedules module that I've included in the resource link that Holly and team will send out later. And if you click on that module, you'll see kind of a further explanation of some of the convergence bidding activity. So there's a tie-in later, and also you'll see in the game-based theory that Frank and Mark will be doing later, you'll also get a little bit of more of a flavor of that. So you'll be able to put that into practice later. So you can kind of, store that in your brain for now, but we'll get to play a game with that later as well to give you a feel for how that works. Any other questions?
Could you define convergence bidding?
So convergence bidding is that the idea of getting the day ahead price and the real time price to become closer together. We call that convergence bidding in the ISO market, but it's that financial participation. Yeah, there was a question over at this table.
Approximately what percentage of the market participates in convergent bidding? Either a percentage of load or I guess it's financial. So,
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but that Department of Market Monitoring report that we'll send a link out to will have that level of detail in it. I just don't have it off the top of my head. Was there another question at that table? Looks like we're getting some fuel for these games for later, so we'll be able to dive into that a little bit later. So that was the second process of the day ahead market. Now we're going to talk about the third process, which is residual unit commitment. And residual unit commitment, if you recall, from the second process, we're clearing bid in supply against bid in demand. And so with that, there may be additional demand that still needs to be met for each one of those hours based on the load forecast for the coming day. And so what the ISO market does is takes a look at the load forecast across each one of those hours and make sure that we've procured enough supply in each one of those hours to meet that forecasted demand. And so the residual unit commitment process, the purpose of this is to ensure grid reliability, because we want to make sure that we are covered from a supply perspective for what the forecasted demand for the next trade date will be. There's a number of different rules and requirements about who has to submit bids into this product versus who can choose to if they want to. I'll get into what we call the resource adequacy program. I'll talk about that a little bit later, so we'll kind of put a pin in that. But essentially, additional supply from resources is offered into this market product as well. It's additional procurement of capacity. If you receive an award for residual unit commitment, what you then are required to do is bid those megawatts into real time as energy. And so the way that works is, and a little bit later, I have a supply example that will take you through what a resource does in day ahead compared to what they do in real time. And so I'll kind of show you how they work through the awards that they get and how the market informs them of what they need to do in real time based on those day ahead awards. So for now, at a high level, the residual unit commitment process, you can think of this as making sure the market has enough supply to meet the demand of the coming day and each one of those hours. We use that same security constrained unit commitment optimization that is done in the second process. It's set up to meet a certain type of demand forecast. It's called a high confidence demand forecast. There's actually a forecasting computer-based training module that you can take a look at if you're curious to learn more about how those load forecasts are developed. So that's something out there that you can access as well. When we get to the residual unit commitment process, we remove the virtual supply and demand bids from the calculation so that we can get a true accurate picture of the amount of physical supply that cleared We compare that physical supply to that demand forecast for that hour, and we use RUC to bridge the gap between the two if said gap exists. And it also introduces the idea of forecasting for variable energy resources. And so that gets factored partially into that demand forecast as well. Later, when we go over individual supplier bidding, I have an example for you of how a forecast for a variable energy resource affects how the market treats bids from that supplier as well. So coming up, I have an example of a conventional type of a resource and also a solar resource and how the market treats bids from those types of resources. And then just two final slides on RUC, and I'll see if anyone has any questions. So if we take a look at those same demand and supply bid curves, there's the total clear demand, physical plus virtual. When we remove those virtual bids or convergence bids from the calculation, we take a look at what physically cleared compared to what the forecast of actual demand will be in that hour. And this RUC process is used to bridge that gap. Now I'll put just a kind of a preview for this afternoon's conversation when we talk about the extended day ahead market and the day ahead market enhancements. And I'll tell you that the way RUC is today now that we're speaking about is going to change in the future. And so I'll talk to you about how that works when we get to the future initiatives section. So today, RUC procures extra capacity to make sure we have enough on hand to meet the demand for the coming day in each of those 24 hours. And there's some analysis of, location of where the supply is needed and things like that. But at a high level, this is how that works. RUC also looks out further than the next trade date. So the market runs for the trade day of tomorrow. RUC will also look maybe 1 or 2 additional days out just to kind of allow the market to get a feel for how those coming days might work. And the reason for that is we still have some resources that are called extremely long start commitment. So it takes them greater than 18 hours to start up. So if I'm going to need to call upon those types of resources, I'm going to need a couple days in advance notice. And so the RUC process allows us to make it so that when the market is doing its optimization, that every type of a resource has the ability to participate given their parameters and characteristics. Specific RUC commitments are generated or manually notified. So if we're going to start up a resource based on RUC that's 2 or 3 days out, maybe our ISO operator will give a call over to that scheduling coordinator to say, by the way, in 2 days, such and such resource is going to be needed. And they'll see that kind of information on other reports as well. But that's kind of how that one works. Does anybody have any questions about this third process? Yes, in the front.
I just want to make sure that I know when RUC comes in before the settlement date, I guess. Is it 3 days before the settlement day within that 7-day span?
So RUC results are published at about 1300 the day before. So you will know 1300 the day before the trade date of all of these various RUC awards. For these extremely long start commitment, those folks might be notified 2 or 3 days in advance. The way that the ISO does its settlement after the fact is, and I can't remember now, do we do the first settlement at, I can't remember how many business days, at 5 business days? I'm like, it's been a while since I taught settlements. Do you want a microphone? Or you may not want a microphone, but. And the first settlement statement comes out at how many business days after the trade date? 5 days. So you'll see from a settlement perspective, you'll get your first statement for this trade date 5 days after the fact. But the reports that provide the data of who has received these awards are provided by 1300 the day before that trade date. Another question there at that table.
Can you please comment a little bit more on the resource adequacy and also the capacity bids?
Yes. I have a section coming up that will explain resource adequacy, and so we'll get into it at that point. So there's certain types of resources that have resource adequacy contracts, and that's coming up in a couple of slides, and I'll explain the resource adequacy at that time.
So basically, whatever the pricing we will be giving, that's different from the day-ahead price.
For those resource adequacy resources,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll make sure that I include that pricing note. Other questions over here? Yes.
So I'm trying to put all these pieces together. So my understanding here is that the RUC exists because we have virtual bidding in the market, and because we have virtual bidding, the actual physical amount of resources that clear the market may be less than the actual amount because some of them did not have physical resources. And so the reason we allow virtual bidding is to converge the real time and day ahead markets. And so my question is, I'm still not clear why that, like what value that adds. It seems like a really complicated additional process. And so I'm still struggling to understand what this virtual bidding is serving the market, like why bringing together these prices is important.
Sure thing. So let me correct a little bit of your understanding. RUC does not exist only because we have virtual bidding. RUC exists because the integrated forward market, which clears bid in supply against bid in demand, is clearing the market based on price. And so we compare all of the bids submitted by the generators to the bids submitted by demand, and where those two bid curves cross, that is as much supply that we can clear for that particular hour. So because we're using price as the deciding factor, you folks, let's say this side of the house are generators and that side of the house are load. Generators are offering in their supply saying, I'm willing to produce energy if you give me X price. And you kind of step your prices up in a certain direction. As the megawatts increase, the price also increases. The load side of the house is the reverse. So as their quantity of megawatts that they are purchasing increases, they want a lower price. Essentially, they're kind of saying the more I buy, the less the price should be. And the generators are saying the more I produce, the higher the price I am expecting to receive. So we bring all of those participants together at the price that matches. And when the supply is too expensive for the load side of the house is when we're finished clearing that particular hour. So what that means is we only clear, let's say, hour ending 3 based on the price that you two sides of the house decide on. That doesn't mean all of their demand is met for that hour. So we have to, from a reliability perspective, because our goal as the market operator is to also ensure reliability of the grid, we have to make sure that now that we've allowed price to determine how much supply is cleared in this particular process, now from a reliability perspective, we're going to take a look and see now how much are we going to need in hour ending 3. And if we need more than we were able to get you two to agree on, then we're going to procure that extra need in this third process to make sure. That's why it's called residual unit capacity. So residual is residual unit commitment. Residual or extra unit commitment means selecting which resources we're going to turn on. So it's primarily because we're allowing the economic market to bring all of these players together to that optimal price point that everyone is kind of agreeing on in each hour. An element of that is the fact that we do allow virtual bidding in in that pool of players, let's say. When we get to that third step, from a reliability perspective, we're done with that financial transactions, that financial participation in the market, and that term convergence bidding. Over time, the activity that is generated by these convergence bids that can be on the supply side of the house or the demand side of the house. So those financial bids are on both types of curves, supply or demand, and essentially those bids apply tension or pressure on the prices, and over time get the day ahead and the real-time price at those specific nodes that they're bidding on to be closer together. So over time, the bidding activity of these financial participants, they'll analyze a node and go, oh, it looks like day ahead prices are, and we've got, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bidding and self-schedules module that will take you through examples of convergence bidding. We kind of, and also the bidding examples that we're going to go into later. But essentially, this bidding activity puts pressure on the prices in those particular areas and gets them from a day ahead and a real-time perspective to be closer together over time. And so that's why that type of financial participation is allowed. It's to give the market participants an actual way to participate in the market financially without doing any type of manipulation that may have been occurring kind of way back in the day. So it gives them a way to do that financial bidding. It gives the market a way to have the day ahead and prices and real-time prices get closer together over time. And also primarily RUC exists to make sure that now that we've allowed the market economics to determine how much supply and demand can be cleared in a particular hour for tomorrow, we take a look at what's actually needed for tomorrow, and we make sure we have everything that we need from a reliability perspective. Does that help kind of fill in the blanks for you?
The question I still have is trying to understand what the importance of bringing the price of the real time and the day ahead together.
Okay, let's see if I can elaborate on that. From a market participant perspective, to have kind of a robust market, our goal is to have the market participants participating in day ahead so that we can get set up correctly at the appropriate price and be all ready for tomorrow. We don't want the market to incentivize people just waiting, thinking, well, I'm not going to bid anything today because I think in real time the prices will be higher. So if they don't have that guarantee of, well, if I just don't bid, then they're going to need me and I'm going to be able to get higher prices in real time. When that isn't happening, there isn't an incentive to kind of hold your capacity for the future, kind of to keep the grid at your beck and call, if you will. So this type of activity occurring in day ahead, where we're purchasing a certain amount of energy at a desirable price, these people who might have a strategy that says, maybe I'm just going to hold out until tomorrow, and then you're going to need me, they may find out that the real-time prices are lower than the day-ahead prices, or vice versa. So when there's no guarantee of if I'll wait, I'll be rewarded, it allows market economics to kind of truly drive the price, because the goal is to get the least priced energy to consumers. I mean, that's the goal of this whole thing. And so part of the allowance of this financial participation is to incentivize all players to come in and day ahead and do that, and also to not guarantee that real-time prices would be lower. And you'll find that this activity creates this convergence, or if the price is essentially going to be the same in day ahead versus real time, just bid in day ahead. Does that help shade in that piece? Okay, there's a question in the back.
Talking a lot about supply, which is great. I'm a little curious more about demand. Given that you have these demand bids and then you have your own way of looking at demand with your models, can you comment on like on average, do those demand bids overestimate their demand, their expected demand for the next day relative to your model? Or is there constantly this residual that you need to add on because they're not bidding as much, they're not expecting as much as you think there's going to be on, and so you have to get more?
You know, I'm not good at knowing the percentages because things change over time, but that level of detail does exist in the reports that are created. So again, and I keep pointing into it, but the Department of Market Monitoring has an annual and quarterly report on market issues and performance, and how much RUC is procured is in those reports. And we also have market reports on a daily basis that provide that level of detail. I'm just going to be frank with you. I don't look at that often enough to be able to give you that accurate information to know, but that data is out there and it does exist. Were there other questions? Yes.
Looking back at that graph or how the RUC works, would you say this graph is, I guess, is pretty close to what you see in reality?
No, this graph is more for visual representation and not necessarily accurate for each hour, because technically, and this is why I mentioned that if you think about how we have the day ahead market enhancements, how we're going to be changing RUC, today now RUC procures additional capacity. In the future, there will be this concept of upward and downward capacity, which we'll get to there. So no, this is more for visual representation to give you a feel for how it might work. This total cleared physical supply and demand could be beyond the forecast. It doesn't always mean that it's lower than. So there can be any number of representations of each hour and how they go into it. And this is also not system-wide, it's in specific locations. So this is more of a generalization just for visual effect than a reality of how it works hour to hour across the system. I think Frank wanted to jump in with a point here, and then we'll, I think, move on to the next. 1 second for posterity and the recording.
Okay.
There's nobody listening right now,
Okay.
but in the future,
But I think-
perhaps you all will be able to listen to it again.
Yeah, I think Rada will be able to answer your question much better about RUC and the role that it plays as once she gets to the real-time market. Because remember, if you're a demander and you with your demand bid, you clear much less than you're actually going to consume in real time, there are financial consequences of that, because very likely the real-time price will be much higher. Why? Because the real-time demand is much higher, and she'll get to that in a minute. But RUC is really just simply because an easiest way to think of RUC is that the ISO has a reliability responsibility. You as a market participant, you just have an economic responsibility to meeting your customers' needs. And so in order for the ISO to be confident that they'll be able to make sure to make it through the next day on the market, have adequate reserves, everything else, that's what RUC is for. And it's not a big deal historically that the amount of dollars that go to RUC, but one thing that is important to think about is that with a lot of renewables, one way you can miss is not the demand, but how much renewables is going to show up. And so in some sense, I think that the ISO probably has a heck of a lot more experience with what's going on system-wide with renewables. And in some sense, that's part of what RUC is doing to make sure we got enough dispatchable capacity so that we're confident that given what we think we might get from renewables, we'll be able to meet reliability. So think of that, you as a customer like reliability, but the ISO is the one that makes sure that it's there. And that's really what the role of RUC is. So in some sense, this is not sort of a financially big part of what's going on. And I think Rada's being very patient with you to explain it all, but the big thing is day ahead real time. So hopefully that was useful.
Thanks, Frank. All right, did I see other hands?
Yeah, my understanding is that California IOUs bid like 95% or more in the day ahead of their load, and then less than 5% or nothing in real time. Is my understanding correct? And then also, is that up like how does that compare to the market broadly? Does the market also bid 95% or less into the day ahead?
I don't have the numbers to check that. I don't have the knowledge to check the accuracies of that number. It may be very likely that that's true. I am unsure how they're bidding. I know from a good utility practice perspective, it's a good idea to make sure you're bidding, perhaps 95% or a good majority of your demand in day ahead to make sure that you are able to procure enough energy for your supply and lock that in. But I just don't know if that number is 100% accurate, nor do I know it's just, I'm not tracking that information. And I'm sure that exists somewhere also in a report, but I'm not sure where. We can see if maybe we can find that out, but I can, Heidi can take a note for that. And I can't tell if you're trying to say something by standing up and if so, could you get a microphone so we could hear you?
I was just going to say that I've been tracking in the back some of the questions that you have about the specific numbers, and I'm trying to communicate with our Department of Market Monitoring. So we'll do our best to get our answers for the more specifics of that for all of you. But if we don't have them all within this class, then we'll definitely be capturing that point to where you can continue to track that information through the DMM reports, and also kind of give you a number for as it is right now. So thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. Appreciate that. Yeah, while we'll be here for, a couple of hours, we'll also be here through the rest of today and tomorrow and can get you that information as well. I think Frank wanted to jump in. You're stealing my time, Frank.
Okay, but I'll give you some of mine. But I mean, particularly the PUC, I want to emphasize the following thing, is that the amount you bid in is not the amount that clears. Because, so you could say that 5% ultimately is what's in the day ahead market. But to say you bid in a certain amount, all the IOUs, I suspect all demand are bidding in at least 100% of what they consume in real time, but it's price. There's this famous economist called Alfred Marshall that essentially said, just as the lower blade or the upper blade of the scissor doesn't cut the paper, it is basically the intersection of the supply and demand that sets the price. And so how much you sell depends upon what the market clearing price is, as Radha exactly said. So if we make the distinction between what you bid in, meaning what does your curve look like and where does it cross zero, clearly everybody's bidding in. Everybody'd love to buy demand at zero, so yeah, they're willing to buy that. But it depends upon where supply crosses, and sometimes it can cross a little bit less, but your number, I think, is, one of the big things that the ISO did, and from the early days at the ISO, was trying to provide the financial incentive so that virtually everything would get scheduled in the day ahead market. So by scheduled mean you cleared, but how much you bid in, I'm pretty confident everybody's bidding in 100% of demand, if not higher, at a zero price or whatever, even a low price, but it's the supply that makes it matter.
And we're kind of in the very beginning of this conversation where we're talking about how the day ahead works. I should point out here that in real time, the demand bidders are not actually bidding at all, because in real time, the demand forecast is what drives the market. So in day ahead, if I'm a load serving entity, in day ahead, that's really the only time I can bid in my demand into the market to try to lock in a price. In real time, load is not bidding in at all. And I'm not talking about like demand response programs or load reduction programs. I'm talking about if I'm a load serving entity, I'm not bidding into real time at all. The only thing that's happening in real time is I'm consuming. The market is using the forecast for those coming intervals to drive how much additional procurement the market is going to be doing. So in day ahead is the only opportunity for folks on the demand side or on the load side to actually bid in and try to get their megawatt consumption at a specific price. So in real time, these IOUs or other load serving entities are paying for anything over and above their day ahead consumption, anything over and above their day ahead award at whatever the real time price is. There is no choice to opt out of that. So that's another reason why you'll see, you may recall when I said earlier, you'll notice that there's more demand self-schedules than there are supply self-schedules, because demand is going to be consuming energy in each of the hours of tomorrow. And they could say, as Frank said, maybe I start my demand bid curve off at, yeah, if I can get 1,000 megawatts for $1, well, of course I'll do that. But it actually has to line up with a comparable supply bid who's willing to supply energy at that price. So right now we're stuck a little bit in theory and process. I promise that it'll get clearer for you, or I hope that it'll get clearer for you once we actually dive into these games where we can say, okay, if I'm load, I'm doing this. If I'm this type of supplier, I'll do that. And we'll get to play with that and pull some of those levers when we get into the market game-based theory a little bit later. So I'm going to have us kind of just step through this theory of how the process technically works. And we're going to move over into real time and kind of get that, stage set. We spent a considerable amount of time. I'm going to try to take us, I'm not sure how much wiggle room I have on break. Maybe I'll eat into break for like 5 minutes. So we can give you about 10 minutes of discussion on the real-time market before we take a stretch break, and then come back for more, and we'll get right back into it. So all of that we were talking about, all of that is just preparation for the coming day, right? So we're trying to make sure that the market is ready to provide energy to all of the consumers in each one of the trade dates of the coming day. That is the plan that gets set, and in real time, we actually see how this operates. So all of the activity that we had been talking about up until this very moment, all of that activity was localized to the California ISO balancing area. Now, when we're talking about the real-time market, this is when it opens up to that broader WEIM footprint. So in real time, there's a larger market footprint that includes all of the Western energy imbalance market participants. Now, the E in that acronym is very crucial because it's the word energy. And today, WEIM is energy only. So I had mentioned this concept of ancillary services or reserves. WEIM participants handle reserves on their own, not inside of the CAISO market, not inside of the WEIM market footprint. So energy only, and does not include ancillary services. In real time, there are no demand bids, like I mentioned. In real time, the load forecast for each entity drives the market awards. So the ISO forecasting team has an idea of how much energy is going to be needed in each of these coming hours and intervals, and we break it down into 15-minute and 5-minute chunks going forward to figure out as a whole, how much does this entire footprint need? Anything over and above what is currently being generated is procured in the real-time market. So there is a plan from the ISO balancing area participants. They have day-ahead awards. From the WEIM participants, they have something called a base schedule, which is that entity's plan of this is how much my load forecast is. These are all of the resources I have lined up to supply my area with that energy, and those players all come into each hour balanced, and then the market engine does a determination and the market runs to figure out the least cost way to serve all of these areas from the collective amount of energy bids that are submitted. So there's something called a resource sufficiency evaluation that's done every hour in WEIM, which is the real-time market. Each entity has to make sure that they have enough capacity brought in to meet their load forecast. Along the bottom of this slide, you'll see a series of tests that take place. So to make sure that balancing is making sure I have enough supply to meet the load in my area. Bid capacity is that I've got a series of bids that also gives me additional over and above what my forecast amount is in case demand actually consumes more in that particular hour. There's also this concept of real time of a certain type of power called flexible ramping to get us through when a resource increases its output. It's called a ramp. And resources ramp in a linear fashion, which means they kind of slowly, you can picture like trying to go up a hill, right? They don't shoot straight up into the air. They kind of slowly crawl up that hill. And so that's called a ramp. And so to make sure that we have enough energy to get through each one of these intervals, there's this flexible ramping product that exists that kind of helps supply a cushion over or under what is currently happening to make sure it's consistently running smoothly. And also the last test is feasibility, meaning does the actual physical transmission system have the capability to have these resources supply energy to this load? Is it actually physically feasible across the transmission system? So there's a whole bunch of checks and balances that are done in real time to make sure that the energy that is scheduled and planned to flow actually is capable of doing it. Do we have extra if it's needed, and all types of intricate things. And I've kind of summed it at a really high level in this kind of set of balancing tests, but that is what is occurring market wide every hour. I'm going to talk a little bit about the inputs. So from day ahead, there's energy schedules, there's awards for reserves, there's information that the ISO has in its master file about each of those individual resources, and also information about the system as a whole. In real time, there's a tool called State Estimator, which provides the state of the system to the market. Every 4 seconds, the market knows exactly what resources are on and running, how much energy they're actually generating, how much energy is being consumed, the actual kind of physics of the grid. In real time, there are extra bids for energy. That's what we call supplemental energy bids. There's day ahead bids for energy, and in real time, there's supplemental energy bids, meaning more bids for energy. There's also bids for ancillary services. That comes from the ISO BAA side of the house. Because this group is for the larger WEIM footprint, I'll do my best to point out things like this is ISO only, or this is the whole real-time market footprint. So I'm going to do my best to keep you apprised of that. This item on the list that's called base schedules, that is solely from the WEIM participants. Because currently there is no WEIM participant in the day-ahead market, there is no day-ahead award to inform what they will then do in real time. So each resource has what's called a base schedule, meaning this is my schedule for this particular hour. And then they may have over and above that a series of economic bids that says, okay, well, I'm scheduled to be running at 50 megawatts, but I have the capacity to provide additional more. So I'm going to bid that additional capacity so that the larger market can use it as needed. And that's what a base schedule is used for. You're coming into the market with a schedule, and then you're bidding economically to provide any excess to the market. The market also consumes information on outages, both on the generation side of the house and on the transmission system. So I may have a resource that should have a capacity of 200 megawatts, but it's being taken down for servicing. And so now I can only provide 150. So the market has that level of detail so that it knows reliably what it can expect from each resource. I also have outages on the transmission system. Maybe a line has either been derated or taken out of service for maintenance. The market knows that, so it knows that whole feasibility test, whether that energy can actually be generated in that particular location. And then finally, transmission limits. So each individual transmission line has a certain rated capacity, and that we need to make sure that those lines are being operated within those limits. And those limits may change based on whether that line has been derated. Sometimes, there's many factors. So All of those elements are taken into consideration in the real-time market as this engine is running. And then what comes out of the real-time market are those real-time dispatches. So this list here shows you at the top what we do every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, the market provides a real-time dispatch instruction to those resources that are currently on and operating, telling them what their output should be in the next 5 minutes. They could say the same as what you're doing now. They could say higher or lower, and it could change every 5 minutes. The next group of 1, 2, 3 elements on that list tells you what we do every 15 minutes. Every 15 minutes, the market is procuring additional reserves, again, just for the ISO BA only. Reserves right now are not handled in WEIM through the market. They're done separately through reserve sharing groups and other such things. Every 15 minutes, the market is also doing what I call moving the big rocks. So the market is starting up and shutting down resources and also transitioning multi-stage generators. So in that 15-minute instructions, the market is determining, are there other resources that need to start up or shut down, or do I need to change the configuration of these multi-stage generators? And then for all of that activity that's taking place in real time, there is financial settlement for that. And that financial settlement for the ISO BA participants, it takes a look at what your day ahead award is. It compares your real-time meter information and your real-time awards and figures out for a resource how you need to get paid and whether you're getting paid for that production in day ahead prices or real-time prices. And then on the load side of the house, it's saying how much did you procure in day ahead? You will pay for that at the day ahead price. How much additional did you consume in real time? You'll pay for that additional consumption in real time at the real time price, and that activity takes place in the settlements. From a WEIM participation perspective, the base schedule is used as the baseline for financial settlements today. So the deviation or the difference between the real-time production output of that resource is compared to what their base schedule is, and any of those imbalances are how the ISO market settles that resource. I know that's a lot to digest, and I know that we do need a stretch break, so we're going to go ahead and do that. You have 10 minutes. If you'll come back at 10:45, we'll dive right back in. If you have a question at the tip of your tongue, go ahead and jot it down so you don't forget it, and we'll be right back. I'm going to pause the recording, so let me do that now.
I got the timing wrong for settlements, and since settlements is an output up here that you mentioned, the first settlement statement doesn't actually come out till 9 days after. So 5 days was the last time we do a price correction. So we do that, we do the price corrections, gather the meter data, and that way it kind of shortens our time, our kind of a 24-month settlements process, because we have more accuracy up front from the information instead of doing as much estimation. So sorry, I just wanted to correct that before you go on break.
Thanks, Heidi. It's been a while since I taught settlements, so I was like, what? Give me a number, Heidi. I have no idea, but 5 was wrong. It's 9. So your first settlement statement is 9 days after the trade date. Thank you for correcting that. We have that verbally. You know, you got to listen to the whole thing to get all the right answers, guys. So I'm going to put the recording on pause, and then we'll come back in just a moment. All right, we're back at it. So to recenter ourselves where we were before the break, we are right now talking about what does the real-time market do and the type of instructions that come out of it. So we do things every 5 minutes and every 15 minutes. And again, when I'm saying we, I'm the market engine. In real time, after the day ahead market results publish at about 1300 the day before, so it is 10:45 now, at about 1 o'clock this afternoon is when the day ahead market results for tomorrow will publish. That action of those reports being published triggers the opening of the real-time market. And then the real-time market is open for each trade hour up until 75 minutes before the top of that hour. In real time, there are a series of processes that take place, and they happen every hour, every 15 minutes, every 5 minutes. And on the chart, you can see from a time perspective, we start off talking about what we do hourly, and then we get down into what we do every 15 minutes and every 5. And that happens continuously for each of the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm going to take us to the next slide that'll break down in detail what each one of them does. We have something called the hour ahead scheduling process, or HASP. This is specifically for intertie bidding activity. For hourly block bids, there are some resources that when they're bidding into the market, their supply is provided in essentially these hourly chunks. They don't have the ability to move that resource every 15 minutes or every 5. So we have a process for those types of resources. The market, as it's running this process, does binding results and awards for those hourly block bidders. And the market will also do advisory schedules and instructions for essentially everybody else. But an advisory instruction is not financially binding, and there is no physical activity of that resource. You should not be following advisories, but the market gives a heads up as to what it thinks the system will be running like. But for those intertie resources, those resources that are, an intertie is a connection point between two balancing areas. And so for an intertie resource, which is in one balancing area, wanting to send its power to another balancing area, they'll bid in at a specific scheduling point between those balancing areas. There are some intertie resources that can move every 15 minutes or 5. For those resources, they'll get their instructions closer to the market interval that's appropriate for them. Another thing that the market does hourly is something called short-term unit commitment. So there was a day-ahead commitment process. If you recall, when I said unit commitment, it means we're choosing what resources to run. In real time, there's something called a short-term unit commitment process. In day-ahead, we can look across the full 24 hours of that trade date. In real time, short-term unit commitment looks out 4.5 hours into the future and figures out if there's any additional resources that we need to start up or shut down based on that time horizon that we're looking at. So the market kind of looks at a trade date in the day ahead from the full 24-hour perspective. In real time, it's zeroing in on these 4.5-hour chunks. In the 15-minute market, which happens 4 times an hour every 15 minutes, the market is doing the same thing, trying to figure out if there's any resources that we need to start up, shut down, transition a multi-stage generator. This is where the market is also looking out at forecasts for variable energy resources. And it's also determining if for the California ISO BA, if it needs to procure any additional ancillary services. The way the market runs is it looks at a specific trade interval, and it will provide you with binding instructions for that trade interval, but it might give you advisory instructions out into the future for future intervals as well, so that those resource operators have an idea of where the market sees their resource possibly operating in the future. And it's just advisory, kind of a heads up. Some folks have likened this to if you are trying to get from here to there and you plug in an address in GPS, it'll give you an estimate time of arrival. And then based on things that happen with traffic, that time to arrive might change. And so that, you know, between here and San Francisco could be an hour and a half, it could be 2.5 hours, depends on what's happening. So at the beginning of your trip, the 1.5 to 2.5 hours is considered to be like maybe an advisory. Similarly, if you translate that concept to the energy market, the market will say in the next interval, your resource should be operating at 50 megawatts. And the following interval, I think it's going to be 55. So you have an idea, well, it looks like the demand is going to be increasing in the future. The demand may not show up and that may not happen. Therefore, you wait until the next binding instruction to actually move that resource. But the market just gives a heads up as to what it thinks might happen. That's every 15 minutes. And then we get down to every 5. So this slide is very granular and it takes you through hour, 15-minute, 5-minute activities. In the 5-minute market, where I like to say that the 15 market is more moving the big rocks, the 5-minute market is kind of fine-tuning what already exists and is on. So in the 15-minute market, we're starting up, we're shutting down, and we're transitioning those resources. In the 5-minute market, that dispatch, every 5 minutes, the market sends out instructions to all of those resources that are currently on and operating and says, this is the output you need to be at in the next 5 minutes. And if you want to get super technical with it, and I don't know if you do or don't, but if we take a look at this clock over here on the wall, the market will issue the market instruction in the middle of every 5-minute block of time on the clock. So it's 10:53 right now. So at 10:52 and a half, the market would have issued an instruction of where that resource needs to be in that next 5-minute interval. And that next 5-minute interval is from 10:55 to 11 o'clock. And that resource has 5 minutes to get to that midpoint. And so in the middle of every 5-minute slice of time on the clock, the market sends out an instruction to the resource, and they have 5 minutes to get to that point by the time they're into the middle of that next minute 5 chunk of time. Does that make sense for everybody? So that happens every 5 minutes where the market is moving these resources. Now, that is for energy instructions. There are also little fine tunings that happen in the California ISO BA, which is ancillary services, which could be moving a resource every 4 seconds. That's something that's happening here in this footprint, but in the WEIM footprint, those WEIM entities are handling their own reserves and regulation capacity separately from the ISO energy market, the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So in WEIM, it's energy only, those 5-minute energy instructions. I'm going to go through, if you'll hold on for one quick second, I'm going to go through this timeline so that you get a feel for the milestones, and then I'll open it up for questions. I just want to carry this thought forward. So in real time, the way the timing of the market works is 5 hours ahead. The market is looking at the forecast conditions and determining if there's any additional power that needs to be committed. That is that short-term unit commitment process. In 75 minutes before the trade hour, that's when the market closes for that particular trade hour. And then the real-time processes kick off. And then every 15 minutes, so 15 minutes ahead of the energy flow, if we're going to be starting up or shutting down a resource, that resource will receive this type of instruction. Start up or shut down. The market is also procuring additional ancillary services in the California ISO BA. And then how that resource is being paid is based on whether or not those megawatts were awarded in the day ahead or in the real time. And it could be a combination of both. I could have a day ahead award that said, you'll be operating at 50 megawatts in this particular interval. And by the time we get to real time, we need you at 55. So for the 50 megawatts that you were awarded at in day ahead, you will be paid the day ahead price. And for that extra 5, you'll get paid for that at whatever that real time market clearing price is. And in a little while, we'll also talk about prices. And then just to cement the idea, every 5 minutes, 5 minutes ahead of the actual energy flow, that's when we have energy dispatched. And there are also real-time 5-minute prices. So in day ahead, the prices are hourly. In real time, you will have 15-minute prices and also 5-minute prices. And what you get paid depends on when that market award was issued. And you could end up being paid a combination of all three of those based on what the market tells you to do and in what interval. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I know we had one in the back.
Question about, this is kind of like sending signals out. Can you talk a little about D rates or poor performance of, like a plant goes down or has a rate, or solar gets blocked, how that feeds into the overall market and how you adjust for that?
Yeah, for sure. So the way the market analyzes information is every 5 minutes, there's a 5-minute forecast of what the demand is going to be in that coming interval. And so while the market is forward looking to figure out, here's where we are now, here's where the demand is going in the future, the forecast adjusts based on not only what the demand activity that's taking place, but also that telemetry or that real-time energy flow information that we're getting from resources. So as you indicated, if there's a resource that maybe has an issue and goes down or derates or is not generating enough energy, the market will see that kind of dip. Now, there are certain things that it can do immediately to respond to that. If it's something serious, we have something called ancillary services products, and those are like contingency things. But normal operations, it will go, okay, in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to ramp up these resources. And another thing we have in real time, which I haven't talked about yet, is the flexible ramping product. And so kind of as the market is sending out instructions, it's sending out instructions every 5 minutes, and the resources are kind of bouncing up and down as if we were kind of conducting an orchestra here. If there's something big or significant that happens, if it would take too long for the market to catch it, meaning like we can't wait 5 minutes for the market to adjust, the ISO market operators or the WEIM entity operators have tools in their control room at their disposal to adjust resources around to make that smooth out. So it kind of depends on the exact issue that occurs as to how the market is going to respond to it. Either the forecast will pick it up and adjust for it, or the actual human intervention from an operator will make an adjustment to the fleet as needed. So there's human beings that actually can control what's happening with the resources, or the market can adjust if the market has time to. So there's automated mechanisms and also human individuals that can make that, that can help smooth over those issues. Other questions? Yes.
Trying to understand like the magnitude of the market involved in each of these processes. So if we assume that 95% of the megawatts are determined in the day ahead and 5% or less in the real time, then what percentage of that are involved in the HASP or in the stuck or in the 15-minute or the 5-minute? Does DMM have information on that, or?
I would imagine that they do. So my session ends at noon, and Heidi and I will see if we can find kind of these numbers that you're looking for. I'm just going to confess that most of the time I spend my time, studying like how things work in theory, and I spend less time analyzing the reports that tell me, this is what happened this week or month. So I know that information is out there. I just have to dig a little bit to get to you. So we'll find that kind of level of detail for you. It's just not at my fingertips. So I want to be responsive to you, but I don't have those numbers. Yeah. Yes.
Are the resources that are bid into the real time, are the resources that go into the day ahead market, once they clear, are they just scheduled and they're settled and they will show up in the market, or do they also participate in the real time market?
They also participate in the real time market as well. And so when we get to, I have a supplier example coming up that shows you what a resource will do. So a resource will bid a certain amount of capacity or energy into the day ahead. And then based upon the awards that they receive, that will inform what they need to do in real time. They could either be awarded for all of their capacity, or they could be awarded for some of that. They could have bid into a variety of energy products and therefore need to do certain things in real time, or they may have been priced out of the day ahead market because their bids were maybe too high. And so they didn't get any market awards in day ahead. And so then they turn around and participate in real time. So there's any combination or more of those couple examples. But yes, they're actively participating both in day ahead and in real time.
So I'm confused. This sounds like a big question, and maybe we'll get into it later in the day, but I'm confused why the market is structured that way. Like, it almost seems to me like, well, why does the day ahead even really exist if they're once again going to bid again? It's like, did that day ahead bid mean anything? Like, are they able to bid anything else they want to, like, strategically in the real time? So what's the point of the day ahead if they're bidding again in the real time?
Yeah, so and we will definitely get there when we get to these games with the Stanford folks, but I will say this, the day ahead market is the market's best plan for how things will operate tomorrow. And so yes, your day ahead awards, I mean, they become a self schedule in real time. So if I'm a day ahead award of 100 megawatts, I'm expected to produce those 100 megawatts in real time. I have a job to do, but my job is not done because when real time comes around, so many varieties of things could happen. It could be that we set a plan for your resource to be running at 100 megawatts, but the demand did not show up. So we always have to match supply to meet what the current demand is on the system. And so, yes, you will have a day ahead award that translates into a real-time schedule, but who knows what's actually going to be happening in that particular hour. And that means we could need more from you, or we could need less from you, or something might happen to your resource between yesterday and today. And even though you want to perform, there was an issue and it came offline. So because of all of those nuances, the goal in day ahead is to set out the best plan to make sure that we can run the grid reliably and have enough supply to meet all of this need. But then in real time, when life actually happens, we have to see what is happening and adjust that plan. And I see Mark very enthusiastically wanting to jump in.
Exactly what Radha is saying. So the day ahead market, it's the best plan, but what it translates into for the generators is, and the demand side as well, it's a firm financial commitment, right? Because you can't dispatch energy, a day ahead, right? So it's a firm financial commitment that aligns, your incentives on either the supply or demand side with, what we think a day ahead is the best plan. And then what you'll see tomorrow is you're still offering in day ahead and you're offering in real time. And so we'll go into more of what that means. What does it mean to have a firm financial commitment day ahead, which, as Radha is saying, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily actually run in real time, but we'll see how that works. So,
and everything gets settled out financially. So all of the activity, both on the bidding side, both on the demand or load side and on the generator side, everyone is getting paid for their day ahead bids if you're a generator, and everyone is paying for that day ahead scheduled consumption if you're load. But then in real time, based on what actually happens, there are adjustments that occur in that financial settlement. And they're just carved out into different categories based on, this was your day ahead award, this was your real time award, this is the actual meter of that generator. And we have that in 5-minute increments. And then there's a comparison to see what they actually performed and then the financial settlement of all of that activity. And then on the load side, this is how much you paid for X amount of megawatts to be consumed in real time in these hours. And then in reality, this is how much you actually used. And then whether that's over and above your day ahead award, determines what you need to do, either pay for additional consumption at the real-time price, or if you purchase too much in day ahead, then you essentially sell that back at the real-time price. So there's a financial element to all of this, separate from just moving folks around. But the interesting or unique thing about electricity is it's the only commodity, at least on a super large scale, that is generated at the moment that it is being consumed. Like, we are getting better at the storage, very true, but we don't have a situation where we can fully store a whole entire balancing areas worth of demand for an entire day in kind of a storage facility. So the uniqueness of the electricity industry is that we have to continuously make sure that the generation is supplying exactly what demand is consuming at this time, but not too much or too little, because then that, for lack of a technical term, really messes things up from a transmission perspective. You know, it harms generating resources if they're operating at not 60 hertz, and the transmission lines can only handle a certain amount of capacity. So you have to make sure it's this nice, finely tuned balance of things. And so that's why it's so confusing, is because it's so precise in nature. And so, you know, it's okay to have this confusion, and we're going to have all of this kind of theory that we're talking about. We're going to be able to dive into the different players across a variety, you know, we're going to be able to try on different hats in the game-based theory to kind of get a feel for what it's like on the participant side. And I think that will help kind of round out the understanding that you have of, like, right now we're talking in theory about technically what the market does, and in theory how the prices work, and what we're going to get to price formation soon. But then when you kind of put it into practice, you'll be like, oh, okay, well, if I'm the generator, this is what's happening to me. If I'm doing this, this is the impact on the whole system. And so I think we'll be able to have a lot of growth and knowledge throughout today and tomorrow, which is, I think, you'll find exciting. I think there's a question at the front.
Yes, how do variable generators participate in this real-time process?
I have an example for you. So when we get to, I have two supplier examples. One is a conventional resource and the other is variable. So if you'll indulge me, and we'll answer that question when we get to the supply example, because I'll have pictures to show you that can help form that knowledge. Question in the front.
Just wonder, and I think this is correct, but are there real-time operators versus day-ahead operators, real-time traders versus day-ahead traders? I imagine there are, because it seems like this, or is there some sort of AI component to it?
They're real-time humans that are doing this work in day-ahead and in real-time, and depending on the size of the organization, it could be same people or it could be different people. If you have a large organization, you may have day-ahead traders, real-time traders, other kind of folks, people who manage outages. If it's a smaller shop, maybe that's more tightly, you know, integrated, and individuals are doing both activities. So it depends on how it's constructed, but yeah, it's human beings that are doing this activity. They do have computers that they use to do some analysis and things like that, but when we're talking about the people that are bidding, it's people that are bidding and submitting these bids into the market. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it seems like if you're a day-ahead trader or operator, you're always, seems like it would be every day that would be happening for
the coming day.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Another question on the table.
Just have a quick question, because it seems like there's so many piece elements in this, and also, you know, the timing requirement. I'm just curious, like, what if you having some, you know, technical issues, like a communication problem, somehow you cannot send out a signal, what will happen afterwards?
Do you mean if the market has an issue and can't send the signal to the generators?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
that can occur. And if that does occur, what we'll tell them is use your last good dispatch, and we'll kind of run in a, you know, the best way possible until we can get over that technical issue. So there's a lot of redundancy in the systems, but there are, yes, technology is wonderful and perfect until it's not, right? And so if we're having a communication issue with the resources, it may be that, you know, the data that the market is being fed is stale or for whatever reason. So there are individuals that are monitoring the system continuously. And if there's an issue that were to occur where these every 5-minute signals, there was some sort of lag in that, then there would be an instruction to the generator operators, you know, on the other side to use your last good dispatch. And we're going to run with that. And then the control room operators here have a way to kind of move resources around to make sure that things are operating correctly. So there's a lot of contingencies and plan A and plan B in place to do that. You know, you'll hear a term used, which is called N-1. And so normal -1. And so everybody has these plans for how to operate in a normal situation. And then if we lose an element, there's also contingency analysis that are done from a perspective of like, what if a transmission line goes out? The way that the market can reroute that energy across other lines in order to serve that area. So there's all kinds of things like that that happen behind the scenes or under the hood, if you will. Yeah. Other questions? All right, resource adequacy. I promised I would get here. So we talked about the day-ahead market and the real-time market, and we spent a good amount of time talking about the processes and technically what happens from a, you know, the market engine perspective. Now we're going to take a little step off to the side to talk about the concept of resource adequacy and forward contracting. Now I will caveat to say, because we're here at the California ISO BA, I'm going to talk about the resource adequacy program for the state of California. And there are other states that have other types of resource adequacy programs that are not reflected in the exact steps that I'm going to show you, but the concept is similar. The idea of resource adequacy or forward contracting is, if I'm a load serving entity, I want to line up generators in advance that I know I can purchase energy from, so that I'm not necessarily scrambling day to day to figure out who's going to serve my load. In the state of California, we have a resource adequacy program. There's the California Public Utilities Commission, and they have certain regulations and RPS, renewable portfolio standards, that are in place. And so there's a number of factors, and there's 5 steps here, and I'll go over this at a high level. There is a module, if you want to dig deeper into the resource adequacy program, that you can look at. I have, as a side note, through Holly and Sienna and the team, I've provided a set of resources that you can refer to for other knowledge. I didn't carve out resource adequacy separately, but at the end of the PDF file that you'll get is a link to our entire computer-based training library. And in that entire library, you can find a module on resource adequacy that will go through this in about 30 minutes. I'm going to take maybe 3. So the goal here of the resource adequacy program, the ISO and LRA's local regulatory authorities determine how much capacity load serving entities need to procure in advance. And there are certain procurement targets that the load serving entity must meet. The load serving entity and the suppliers that they contract with provide that data, we call it a demonstration, provide that data to the ISO both on an annual and on a monthly basis. So in California, in the month of October, there's an annual showing where load serving entities say, I have contracted with these suppliers for next year, and it's based on a certain % of my load forecast. And the suppliers turn around and say, I've contracted with these load serving entities, and I'm going to be supplying them energy. So during that demonstration process, the load serving entities provide data to the ISO and to the CPUC to let us know what procurement has taken place. The ISO then does an assessment to make sure those load serving entities have hit those targets. If not, there's some opportunities to cure that deficiency. And then after that takes place, those suppliers that are now under contract to provide energy to those load serving entities have something called a must offer obligation. So MOO, you'll see that acronym. If I am being paid as a generator for my capacity, I have what's called a must offer obligation. I have to offer at least those contracted megawatts into both the day ahead and the real time. So a little bit earlier today, I said there's some rules between some participants who have to do certain things in the market and other participants who can choose to do certain things. In the case of a resource adequacy contract in the state of California, you have a must offer obligation, which means you have to offer those megawatts into the market because you're being paid for that capacity through that RA contract. So the ISO does an analysis to make sure that you are offering that supply into both the day ahead and the real-time market. That's called making yourself available to the market. So the ISO will assess the availability of those resources and also their performance. Now that was at a super high level. Question in the back.
For the suppliers that are coming in for the availability and performance through these MOOs, are those coming in as self-scheduled, or do those go in as the price that they're bidding as on that curve?
Both of those, depending on the type of RA capacity that they have been contracted for. So there's generic RA that can either be self-scheduled or bid in economically, and then there's flexible resource adequacy that has to be bid in economically. And there's also some nuances and rules around that. And so you'll find, as with everything at the ISO, there's maybe a yes, but exceptions. And so this is another one of those situations where we're going to talk about those. Did I lose my mic? Oh no, there we go. So this picture here, if I'm a load serving entity, I have a specific RA target that I need to meet. Like I said, both at the annual level and then at a monthly level. So this whole picture here, this pie, is me, the load serving entity, contracting with all of these different individual suppliers to meet my obligation. Once I meet that obligation, this individual slice of the pie is that one individual supplier's showing, their RA showing, which becomes their must offer obligation. So if I'm a load serving entity, once I've done my job of contracting with these resources, the responsibility for those resources to actually meet those obligations and to actually offer their supply into the market, that's their obligation. So the load serving entities meet their obligation once they meet their targeted numbers. The suppliers meet their obligation by consistently offering that supply into the market. Now you'll find there's nuances such as seasonal requirements of how many megawatts that need to be offered, certain hours of the day. I mentioned flexible resource adequacy. If that program was stood up for the very specific reason of, if I'm a variable energy resource, well, there's no way I can say I can offer 24 hours a day. If I'm solar, the sun is simply not shining in certain times of the day. So a flexible resource adequacy contract allows me, a solar provider, to still participate in resource adequacy, but for a certain type of product that's available in a subset of hours versus other generic resource adequacy programs where they have a requirement to meet 24 hours a day. So when you think about the way the ISO designs elements of market participation, the goal for us is to be transparent and to make sure that everybody has the ability to participate. There may be certain things that we have to do to make it so that it's fair and balanced for everyone. And as new technologies come into place, we may have to adjust some of the rules or create a new participation model. And that is something that happened with the variable energy resources. So wind and solar have a certain type of capacity. There's also different categories that fall into that. We can dive really deep into that, but we're not going to do that today. But the takeaway from this is, if we think back to the residual unit commitment process, Anybody who has a must offer obligation for resource adequacy, when they're submitting their bids into RUC, it's $0. Why? Because the market, from the perspective of load, has already paid them for that capacity through that RA contract. And the capacity is to make themselves available. So the the residual unit commitment process, which procures additional capacity in day ahead to be used in real time, is similarly a capacity product. So load is not going to pay the resource 2 times for capacity before that has actually ever even been generated and turned into electricity. So there's some nuances with regard to price, and you'll see, and I'll show you where you can take a look at how often RUC prices are above 0, and it varies day to day seasonally, but you'll find that RUC prices tend to be low because we're getting the majority of that capacity from this already contracted resource adequacy suppliers. So that's kind of just a side note. Question in the front.
Yes, so how often are these resource adequacy contracts concluded? Is it on an annual basis, a daily basis?
The contracts tend to be annual, but then there's a certain amount of activity that occurs in a monthly time frame. So the procurement targets vary by the type of load serving entity, depending on who your local regulatory authority is. And I can't remember off the top of my head what the procurement targets were, but I think it's something like a year ahead, you have to make sure you procure 90% of what your load forecast is going to be. But then when we get closer to that month, you have to make sure you're procuring, I think it's 115% or more, so that you're procuring your load forecast plus a little extra. So there is annual activity that takes place in RA, and then there's also a monthly element where you may need to procure it a little bit more leading up to each month. And that starts 45 days, or that starts and then concludes 45 days out. So there's kind of a time frame that is incorporated into all of that to make sure that they're meeting those targets ahead of time, but there is a timing element to it. Yeah.
And is this something that the California ISO manages, or is it sort of outside the market or responsibility that load serving entities have?
So in the state of California, the local regulatory authority, let me go back to that slide here. The ISO and the local regulatory authorities, so CPUC and in some cases like cities, determine the procurement target and then tell the load serving entity what they need to, how many megawatts they need to procure. So I would say that we more manage the process than dictate the process. Largely, the local regulatory authorities are the one telling the load serving entities, you must do X. We may inform by providing data to those organizations so that they know what the load forecasts are going to be, but the ISO more manages the process from a market participation perspective. So we are involved in a day ahead and a real-time time frame, making sure you're meeting your must-offer obligations, and we're also checking through the demonstration process to make sure that they've met those targets. But there's other organizations that are more controlling or setting the rules for that and shaping that policy. So we kind of comply with or make sure that the market can accommodate the rules that are set in place elsewhere. All right.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So I guess I'm still confused with what can be counted as a RA resource. It sounds like there's a certain requirement. It's now like everything LSE procure can be counted as RA, right? It has to meet a certain requirement. So my main question is when we come to Iraq, but how do we know what kind of resource can be counted as a RAC?
For residual unit commitment, any resource can bid into that product, but there are certain resources that have to. So The requirements for whether or not you can be a resource adequacy resource are separate from the ability to bid into RUC. I could be a generator that has no resource adequacy contract at all, and I could choose to bid into the energy and into the RUC product. The have to comes into place if I am a resource adequacy resource. And if I am a resource adequacy resource, there are certain programs that I may have qualified for, meaning, you know, if I'm if we'll use the variable energy resource, for example, if I'm solar, then I can provide flexible RA, meaning I could be available in a subset of hours from the full 24 hours of the day. And because my fuel source is variable, the sun, if my solar plant is, let's say, a 500 megawatt solar plant, the amount of RA I'm actually eligible to procure is a lower number. They call the EFC, effective flexible capacity, based on historical information and other such things. So I may be a 500 megawatt solar plant, but I have an RA contract of maybe 300, because I cannot guarantee I can always give you 500, versus a conventional resource, maybe with the gas fleet, I fall into generic resource adequacy, where I can guarantee that I can provide X number of megawatts all 24 hours of the day. It's just a different type of contract. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. I guess I probably still don't quite understand is, you know, for the RA, you mentioned they can also participate in the day ahead and real time. So I guess I'm more puzzled, like how, if I'm an RA resource, how do I know where I should go?
Okay, if you are an RA resource, there's certain obligations that you have based on your contract. And if you are confused about what you have to do, we have something, and I haven't mentioned this word before yet, but I will now. There's something called a business practice manual, which is at the ISO, we have various lines of business of different things. So there's one that's called reliability requirements, and that manual has all of the rules that are required for an RA resource. So you could look up in that manual, if I am this type of a resource with this type of flexible, there's a table that will show you. If I'm this type of a resource with, I have this type of a contract, I must meet X requirements based, you know, in this time frame. So there's rules that they will follow based on who they are and the type of contracts they signed. Yeah. Yeah, sure thing. All right. I have about 30 minutes, and I'm going to go through pricing. Hopefully you have a little bit of sense of this, especially if you did the fixed and variable cost computer-based training module that Stanford sent out. If not, there's also a link in the follow-up reference material that you'll receive later to the ISO's market pricing and also bidding and scheduling model. So we're going to talk about this, but think of this as more of a tee up for what we're going to really dive into later today. So we're going to talk about locational marginal pricing and transmission constraints. You may, if you took those computer-based training modules, this word marginal may pop out at you. Marginal is the cost of serving the next megawatt of energy. And so the ISO uses what is called locational marginal pricing, the marginal cost of serving the next increment of demand at that P node or price node, consistent with existing transmission constraints and the performance characteristics of resources. So we determine the price of energy as the market clears based on this marginal cost. And we'll go through some examples of how that works in the games today. But at a high level, I just want to share with you some of the foundational information. First of all, there's thousands of price nodes throughout the system. If I am a supply resource, I am generator 1. I have a price node based on where I am interconnected to the grid. This is my pricing node. I have a LMP at my location. If I am demand, I have a collection of nodes in my area. And there is what we call a LAP, or a load aggregation point, which is an average of all of those prices that I am charged for my consumption in that specific zone. And here's that same language just sprinkled over the map in a different way. So if I am a resource, I get paid for my energy production based on where I'm physically located, where my node is. We threw a couple of generators all across the West. These don't really correlate to anybody, but for visual representation. If I'm load, there's a bunch of load nodes in a particular area. I pay the weighted average price of all of the load nodes in that service territory for my consumption. If I am an import or an export, I pay or am paid the price at the scheduling point. So from the perspective of the CAISO BA, an import of energy is energy coming from another balancing area into our area. An export is a generator inside of the ISO footprint sending energy to another balancing area through an intertie. And so that activity is at those scheduling points, and that's what we refer to as imports or exports. The locational marginal price has a couple of different components to it. So there's that price of energy, which is going to be that market clearing price, but we also add to that the cost of congestion or losses in a particular area. So my load node, if I'm over here, could be different from the price over there based on congestion on the system or transmission constraints or physical losses in transmission. And so the pricing module that you can take a look at online after the fact, we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. I'm just going to set that to the side for now. We also have a component called greenhouse gas that is included into the LMP for generators, for generation that today occurs outside of either the state of California or Washington that is delivered to the state of California or Washington. And let me give you a little bit of background on why that is. Certain states have a cost on carbon, and so generators within that state have certain requirements they have to pay, carbon emissions costs they have to pay to the state they reside in. If I'm a generator in California, I already know and expect that I have to pay that to the state, so I build that into my operating costs. If you over there in the back, if Heidi has a generator outside of the state of California and is bidding into the market, she may not know at the moment of submission of that bid whether her energy is going to be used for my state or for another state that does not put a price on carbon. So in her bid, she's going to add a GHG adder, a dollar amount to say, this is how much greenhouse gas, this is my adder, and if you dispatch my resource to one of those two states, then I'm going to need a little bit more to cover my GHG cost, essentially is what we're saying. Let me preface this with right now it's California and Washington, and I also later, if we're able to get to slide 50 something, I have an explanation of how this is going to work in the future with the extended day-ahead market. So for now, Washington and California have GHG regulations with a price on carbon. The market is able to accommodate that and calculate that in the price. The market determines whether or not that resource, their energy was, we call it deemed delivered to one of those states. If so, they have an additional component to their price. I want to just kind of walk through a short example of what that looks like. So in WEIM, the approach for GHG emissions is resource specific, and that resource can choose whether they want to offer their capacity into an area that has GHG regulations or not. So we'll walk through some examples. First example is I'm a gas resource and I'm going to make myself partially available to states that have this GHG requirement. So let's say I have a 100 megawatt resource. I'm going to offer my energy into the market at 50 megawatts. And I'm also going to add a $15 per megawatt hour greenhouse gas adder, which is what I'm saying is I'm offering half of my resource to the market in general. And if it's dispatched for either California or Washington, there's this GHG cost adder that's going to be added to the price. If I'm dispatched somewhere else other than those two states, that GHG adder does not apply to that bid. The second example is I'm not participating in a state that has a GHG requirement for whatever reason. Again, it's the generator's choice. We've constructed the market to give them the opportunity to operate their resource as they would like to, and these are the options. Let's say they don't want to participate in states that have this GHG requirement. So they would say, well, I'm not going to include, or I'm going to zero out there's a certain field in the bidding tool where you indicate how many megawatts you're willing to offer to an area that has this GHG regulation. If they don't put it, if they zero that out, essentially what they're saying is I'm offering my resource to the market, but I'm not offering it to those states that have GHG requirements. You could also be a resource that does not face a GHG cost of compliance. So I could be a clean resource. Here's a wind resource. And I could say, I'm offering my resource with $0 in the GHG bid adder, essentially saying, you can use my capacity for any state that you would like, with or without a GHG. And if you do dispatch me to a state that has that requirement, I don't have, I'm not going to have an additional GHG cost on top of that. So there's a variety of things that could occur. And that's just kind of for you to take that away with. Like I said, I'll talk to you a little bit more about GHG in the future when we get to the new initiative slides. I'm going to take another angle on pricing, and we're going to talk about scarcity pricing really briefly. The goal here is to understand the concept of what scarcity pricing is. I don't know if we're going to get into that in one of the games, possibly not, or we'll talk about it, but just to give you an idea, I've got a bunch of resources here lined up, and I've got transmission available over here on the other side of the slide. In a situation where the next available megawatt from these resources will actually not help relieve congestion in an area, it is possible that we'll enter a situation where scarcity pricing is involved. And what this means here is there are some times when the market clearing price in certain areas could be significantly higher based on certain transmission constraints. I'm going to now show you a slide that describes transmission constraints so we can kind of round out that piece of knowledge. So if I am looking at a giant interconnected grid with a bunch of resources everywhere and then transmission lines connecting all of those resources, the way the market pricing is structured, the goal is to reduce congestion on the overall system, as well as make sure we're not overloading any specific transmission line. So you'll recall that we had an acronym we talked about earlier called Security Constrained Unit Commitment. So this is that security constrained part of it. I want to make sure that I'm keeping the transmission system operating within each line's appropriate capacity. So we take a look at what is the line rating, and we take a look at what is the cost of the next megawatt in a certain area. And the way that the energy is flowing may make it so that certain lines are reaching their capacity. Therefore, we need to flow energy across other lines. And what this means is I could be in a specific load pocket that is using a large amount of energy right now, and there's very cheap energy, perhaps way far away from me in a neighboring area or other state that might not have the ability to get all the way to me because the transmission between me and them is constrained or limited. So I might have to fire up, the load serving entity might have to fire up a more expensive internal resource internal to that area in order to meet the demand. So there can be situations where market prices in certain areas that are transmission constrained are much higher than perhaps other areas. And it's all a matter of how much demand is actually being consumed at this moment in time, the lines around that area, how maxed out are they, and then where the least cost generators might be, might not always have a nice way to connect and flow their energy across the entire system. So hour to hour, this could change. You recall that the market makes adjustments every 15 minutes and every 5 minutes. So not just hour to hour, but also between this 5-minute increment and 15 minutes down the line could be significantly different. It all just depends on truly what is happening in the system, how much energy is being consumed. Are we in summer? Are we in winter? You know, is it more of turning on heaters later in the evening, or is it a really hot day in the summer and everybody's kicking on their air conditionings? Or, you know, which factories are currently, you know, producing certain materials? So depending on quote unquote what the world, our footprint is doing, will determine these adjustments in prices. Let's see. I wanted to get to these bidding examples because I'm hoping that these tie a nice bow on these concepts for you before we dive into really putting it into practice with the Stanford team. So let's take a look at first a conventional resource and then a solar resource and kind of what they do based on how the market operates. My first example is a conventional generator. We're going to be bidding into day ahead, and the takeaway from this slide is written down here at the bottom. So I'll show you what they're doing at the top, and then we'll talk through the takeaway at the bottom. I've got some acronyms on this slide. The PMIN is the physical minimum amount that this resource is able to operate at reliably. And the PMax is that physical maximum. So this resource can operate in between the 50 to 140 megawatts. When this resource is bidding into the day ahead market, they can bid into all of the different products that they qualify for. So they could, and I'll walk through one example of what they did just as a hypothetical. This resource has submitted a 70 megawatt energy self-schedule. So for those 70 megawatts, what they're saying is in hour ending 11, I'm going to be running at 70 megawatts. I'm accepting whatever that price, whatever that day ahead price is, I will accept that. And I'm also saying I'm going to stack additional bids on top of that economically and say, I have to be running at 70 megawatts. Maybe this is to fill a contract that I have with a certain load serving entity, and I've contracted for a portion of my supply. And now I'm saying, now it would be nice though, if the price is to my liking, I'm willing to give you the rest of it essentially. And so I can structure my bid curve saying, you know, if you want me to move from 70 to 80, I want that price to be at least $35. And if you want me to move from 80 to 90, I'd like that to be 40, or however you want to structure that all the way up into your maximum 140. That is a set of economic bids. Now, separately, additionally, I can also say, and this is a CAISO BA participant, I can also say I have qualified for a certain product. It's called ancillary services, and it's called spinning reserves. So I can offer extra capacity into the market, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to give 40 megawatts into that type of product. I'm also a load serving entity. I own this resource, and in order to procure ancillary services for my area, I'm saying I'm going to self-provide a couple of those megawatts. In other words, I don't want the market to buy extra capacity for me. I'm going to say if I need extra capacity, I'm going to use this resource right here. And I'm also going to say, and you know what? And I'm going to throw 10 megawatts into RUC also. I'm going to offer RUC 10 of my megawatts. Now, if you added all of those megawatts up, you will see that it exceeds the 140, right? That is okay, because what the market does is based on what you have submitted into the market, it does an optimization to figure out the best way to use this resource across the system, across the series of hours and products. So based on the bids this resource submitted compared to all of the other bids everybody else submitted, the market decides how many megawatts of energy do I want to award this resource, and how many megawatts do I maybe want to put in the reserves category, and how many megawatts do I want to put into RUC. So the same megawatts from this resource are being offered into a bunch of different products, and the market figures out the optimization, the best way to use that resource. And that optimization will change in the day ahead, hour to hour, based on what the load looks like, based on what the load has bid in. This little call out at the bottom or the end of the slide said, RUC bids are processed separately. So after IFM clears energy and ancillary services, if there's anything left over, RUC can have a piece of that too. So the market co-optimizes energy and ancillary services. It figures out the best way to use this resource across the day. And then it gives market results to that resource. And then based on that, they have real-time activity. There's a question in the back.
Is it safe to assume, or are the RUC megawatts, is that a generally a higher price than, say, when you do that optimization, what's the incentive for a generator to, say, set aside some for RUC rather than, because obviously I think if you're a generator, you want to pick which of these services has the highest price.
Yeah, I do know the answer to that question, though I may not have answered the other ones before, but with RUC specifically, you'll find that RUC prices are lower. Why? Because for RUC, with the resource adequacy resources that we talked about, they have to offer into the market at $0 for that RA capacity. And so the market, based on least cost, is going to take those RA resources first for RUC. So you'll see that RUC prices tend to be low, maybe $0, maybe $3. I'll show you a place where you can see what those prices are. But RUC tends to be not as, the cost for RUC is not as high compared to the other like spinning reserves, for example. And that is because those RA resource people have to offer their capacity into RUC at $0. So you're not going to get a lot in RUC compared to the other products.
So I guess those RA generators, those RA, they might be getting paid more because that's a different service entirely. They're billing, and that's that MU section. So I guess I would assume there's some price relation to making sure we've got reliability, like.
Right, and there's a bilateral contract between the load serving entity and that supplier for that capacity in the first place. That's one revenue stream. From the market, there must offer obligation into RUC $0. So RA people are not getting a lot of money in RUC because their RA capacity is all treated as $0. But their revenue stream initially is from that bilateral contract, which is why the market is not going to pay them 2 times for capacity because they haven't even generated it yet. But if you now let's go to the next slide. This is what happened in this hypothetical scenario. And I'll kind of break this down. So let's start from the bottom with RUC. RUC, they were awarded 10 megawatts. And what they have to do with that is on the right. So submit real-time energy bids for this award. So if I receive a RUC award in day ahead for 10 megawatts, then in that particular hour, you'll see at the top of the column HE11, so hour ending 11. I have to bid 10 megawatts of energy into hour ending 11 because I have a RUC award. So that's something I have to do. And if we read up the chart, there's the next 3 blocks relate to energy. So I had self-scheduled 70 megawatts. Then I had submitted a series of economic bids of which the market took an additional 10. So in the column or in the row that says cleared, that's the total amount of energy that cleared for that hour. So I have a real-time self-schedule of 80 megawatts tomorrow in hour ending 11. And because I also bid into these other products at the top of the chart, those ancillary services, I also have to submit real-time energy bids to cover those. So down here at the bottom left of the slide, what did I have to do in this hour based on my day ahead awards? Coming into real time, hour ending 11, I have an 80 megawatt self-schedule. Now I'm getting paid for those 80 megawatts at this day ahead price of whatever hour ending 11 was. In real time, to meet my obligation of all of these other day ahead awards, I have to stack an additional 53 megawatts of energy economic bids on top of that 80. So that takes me to 133 megawatts total. And if you recall, my resource was 140 megawatts PMAX. So I still have 7 extra megawatts unallocated. And in real time, I could, if I want to, submit economic bids to cover that as well. There's a difference between the you have to's versus you can, right? So based on my day ahead activity, I get an 80 megawatt schedule for this hour and I have to bid in an additional 53. And I could take that all the way up to my PMAX of 140 if I wanted to in that particular hour. Does that help kind of tie a bow on day ahead to real time for this particular resource? Or what are the questions that we have on this in the back?
What restrictions or guidelines do they have to follow for the economic bids that they then place in the real-time market for those 53 megawatts?
Yes, so we haven't talked about this yet, but there's a bid floor and a bid cap. So the bid floor is negative $150 and the bid cap is a soft bid cap of 1,000 or a hard bid cap of 2,000 if you're able to justify operating costs over and above the 1,000. So there are bid floor and ceiling that they need to operate within. All right, variable energy resource. Before we get to lunch, we will do this variable energy resource. And then I'll chat with the folks at the back on how we want to talk about coming initiatives and if we can slot that in. I'll let you all be the judge of that. Okay, variable energy resources. They're treated a little bit differently in day ahead versus real time. If you can think about it from a logic perspective, in the day ahead time frame, my forecast of output for that variable energy resource is a certain amount of reliable, but it's not 100% accurate. So in day ahead, whatever the forecasted output is for that variable energy resource, the market has, and it's used from an advisory perspective, but it doesn't drive the market awards. Meaning if I'm a 100 megawatt solar resource and I have a forecast of 80 in a particular hour tomorrow, if I bid 100, the market can award me 100 and I'm expected to be available. So if you're a variable energy resource bidding into the day ahead, you have to be cognizant of what your forecast is and try to bid accordingly. It's different in real time, however. In real time, the market will take that forecast and use it to actually drive market awards. So in real time, if I have a self-schedule of a resource, whatever that self-schedule amount might be, remember I have to submit my bid in 75 minutes before the top of the hour. By the time that actual trade hour rolls around, my forecasted output could have changed. And we want those variable energy resources to be able to produce as capable as long as there's enough demand to warrant that. So if I have a self-schedule at a particular level, the market will actually adjust my award to whatever that forecast is. However, if I am bidding in economically, the market will respect my economic curve related to the forecasted output of my resource. So I'll give you an example so we can see what we're talking about. For this resource in real time, they have a physical minimum of 0 and a maximum of 100. Going into this hour ending 11, they have submitted a bid for 70 megawatts of a self-schedule. A self-schedule means I'm saying 70 megawatts, I'm not tying any price to it. I'm going to be running at 70 megawatts, whatever that market clearing price is, I'll take it. If I have a forecasted output of 90 megawatts by the time we get to that market interval, that resource will receive an instruction to generate 90 megawatts. The market is going to extend the self-schedule quantity to match the forecast amount. That's if it's a self-schedule. If this resource has an economic bid component to it, then the market is going to look at that economic bid and use that bid to inform how many megawatts the resource should actually be generating. In other words, if the resource is saying, I'm only going to generate if the price is at least such and such, and the price is lower than that, the market may not necessarily dispatch that resource. Notice how I said may not necessarily do it. There also may be situations where we are in tight supply conditions and the resource might receive an award for something that is uneconomic to them in a particular hour. There's a whole other component we're not even going to get into today, but it's something called bid cost recovery. It's a way for the market to ensure that if I am a resource being awarded by the market and it is not actually economic for me to be running. The market is going to look at the revenue that I generate across the day to make sure that I've earned enough revenue to cover certain operating costs. There's a whole bunch of nuance to that. Like I said, we won't go deeply into it, but that there is an element of reliability there where some resources may be dispatched uneconomically because they're needed, and there is a way to financially settle with them after the fact and also make sure that they're made whole. There's a number of exceptions and requirements to that, but that's generally how that works. I'm doing a time check. It's 11:56. Let's see how much further we can get. Okay, so we've reached the area where now we're going to talk about upcoming market changes, and I think we may not be ready for that yet. Let's see if we've got a couple more questions, and then we'll see how we want to handle this next discussion. Before we talk into switching gears to the future, do you want to revisit anything that we talked about and maybe ask some clarifying questions to really solidify that foundation in the front?
Yes, you were showing a few slides back where the generator had 70 megawatts of energy self-schedule. So what I'm curious about is, so in the California ISO, can generators have contracts outside of the market, and is that taken into account in any way with the market payments?
Yes, so a generator can have a bilateral contract with a load serving entity, and that contract activity is not part of the ISO market necessarily. We do have something called inter-SC trades, which is a way that the market can account for that financial agreement and essentially settle out that inter-SC trade in the market so that, and I don't have slides to show you, but if you think about it from the load serving entity's perspective, if I'm contracting with you, the supplier, I'm paying you under the contract that we have together. And then through the market, I'm paying also for my consumption of the energy that's being produced. And you, the generator, you're getting paid through my contract. And then any megawatts you generate, the market is also paying you. Technically, if you want to, if we were thinking about just two participants, technically the load serving entity is double paying and the generator is double receiving, right? If there's a contract and there's also market activity. This inter-SC trade concept allows those parties to go in and indicate to the market, at this particular scheduling point, we are producing 70 megawatts of energy. They're going to be consuming 70 megawatts of energy in an inter-SC trade. And it essentially allows the market to respect that contract at that particular scheduling point and have a certain dollar amount associated with that allows for the unwinding of what that double payment might look like. And I don't have a slide to show you that visually, but there's an element of the market that allows for this voluntary inter-SC trade activity so that you guys can line those two up together. Does that help at all?
Yes, and about how large are those bilateral contracts compared to what the ISO does through the market?
It depends on the type of load serving entity and where they're located, right? So if you think about a load serving entity that needs to meet 90% of their load through these resource adequacy contracts, they probably have a contract for a good portion of that amount and only incremental through the ISO market. But all of that activity still needs to be scheduled within the market so that those megawatts can flow appropriately. So I would say, depending on the type of load serving entity, what their if they have any resource adequacy requirements that they have to meet is going to kind of maybe determine how much of their load they've forward contracted versus how much they're getting incrementally from the market. I think we have some forward contracting examples that we're going to go through in the games that we can kind of maybe get a feel for how that works also. Okay, it's noon. I want to, there's Holly, there's Sienna. I want to double check to see how we're going to handle maybe the rest of the day. I know we still have some stuff to cover, but we also have some lunch speakers. So help me out.
Hi, this is Stacy. I guess a poll. How much do you have left in this segment in terms of time?
I have about 20 more slides, but they're faster in theory, in that I could give kind of like a quick flyover of EDAM and DAME and maybe just go through it like in one shot, perhaps without pausing for questions. That could be done pretty quickly. It's kind of to the temperature of the room is
Got
how,
it.
you know.
Okay. Who needs a break? Who needs to just kind of?
Do we want to do like a 5-minute break and then?
Yeah, if that, maybe we do that, a 5-minute break and then come back for 15, then break for lunch. Does that sound okay? Those burritos were pretty heavy, so maybe people aren't starving.
When is the
We have,
the
DM
lunch speakers?
Yeah, Eric Hildebrand, our DM, our Department of Market Monitoring Director, is ready, and we thought we would start with him, kind of flip the order around.
For sure.
When we're ready. Yeah.
So
Frank?
yeah, let me pause this.
Yeah, we're going to have him. The question is, do we take a break now and just finish this segment? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording now. We'll take a 5-minute stretch break and then we'll get Eric in the room for his session.
Yeah,
That sounds good.
sounds good. Okay. Yeah, and Heidi's just kind of teeing up.
Okay, folks, we've got 10 minutes before the tour, so I'm going to kind of do a little short and sweet flyover of the upcoming initiatives. You will have many opportunities to talk to me over the rest of today and tomorrow on this, and also these initiatives are happening in 2026, so you will also have many other opportunities to engage with the ISO on these. But at a high level, I wanted to just give you an insight into some of the coming changes, as I know, especially utilities in your area are determining whether or not this is something that they want to participate in. So it's important for you to know kind of a certain level of detail of them. We have 2 upcoming exciting market changes. One is called the extended day ahead market, and the other is day ahead market enhancements. And your takeaway from today is to be able to, all right, had to get the clicker working again, to get a high level overview of what they are. So the extended day ahead market, the goal of this one is to essentially all of that day ahead market activity that we were talking about at the beginning of today. Right now, none of the WEIM participants are participating in the day ahead market. So the extended day ahead market is opening up all of that day ahead bidding activity to the larger WEIM footprint. For those WEIM participants that voluntarily choose to opt into the extended day ahead market, there's about an 18-month long onboarding process that takes place and signing of an initial agreement. So key takeaway from the extended day ahead market is we're extending the day ahead market to the larger WEIM footprint, offering it to them so that they can take those benefits. What does it do? It builds on the current WEIM to optimize the commitment of generation a day in advance. Today, we're doing this for WEIM in real time. The goal is to extend this so they can also participate in that day ahead activity and have that full 24-hour planning horizon optimized by the market. The goal of that is to have additional economic, grid reliability, and environmental benefits, being able to harness that throughout the entire West. The participating balancing areas would still retain their existing resource planning, transmission planning, and reliability functions, but they would be tapping into that day ahead market activity. Some of the elements of what that is, I mentioned that we had in the real-time market an hourly resource efficiency evaluation. We talked about that when we talked about the real-time market. So another thing that we would be adding to the day ahead market is something called a daily resource efficiency evaluation that has that analysis across that full 24-hour time horizon. The resource efficiency evaluation, here abbreviated as RSE, is essentially a universal adapter that brings together entities that may have different resource adequacy programs and allowing them to commit and efficiently dispatch those resources. So earlier we talked about the California Resource Adequacy Program, but there are other states that have maybe or other entities that are participating in their own integrated resource adequacy program or the Western Resource Adequacy Program. All of that type of procurement is procurement in varying different time horizons. What the resource sufficiency evaluation does is brings all of those entities together in a day ahead and real-time planning perspective and allows that capacity to be offered into the market so that it can be optimized. So that's an element of the EDAM, or the extended day ahead market. Another element is making sure that that transmission capability between those balancing areas is going to be optimized. So interties are those connection points between balancing areas as well as the entire system, and operating the transfer of energy between those participating areas. And then finally, we had talked a little bit about greenhouse gas adders and how those are handled today for the states of California and Washington. With this extension of the EDAM, or the day ahead market, through the larger West, you will find that there are some states that have no price on carbon, but perhaps a climate policy. And you'll find other states that don't have any greenhouse gas regulations at all. And the goal of the extended day ahead market is to make sure that we're able to bring those participants together, but we don't impose GHG costs and regulations in particular states that don't have any such requirement. So the market, depending on the entity and where it's located and the requirements that it needs to meet, will be accommodated through that GHG element. That was a quick overview of the EDAM. Essentially, takeaway from that is the day ahead market, we're extending that to the West, and we're adding a little bit more in the transmission and the greenhouse gas component area, and how that kind of gets worked out between all of the states. When we talk about now the next initiative, which is called Day Ahead Market Enhancements, that essentially, the day ahead market that we are extending to all of those WEIM participants, we're also at the same time enhancing and adding a couple more products to that. So these DAME enhancements are automatically included if you're participating in EDAM. This day ahead market that we are at the same time enhancing would be what we're extending to those participants. So we're changing and enhancing the day ahead market and essentially establishing two new market products, something called imbalance reserves and reliability capacity, which we'll walk through what those two are. To one of the market products, the integrated forward market, we're adding this concept of imbalance reserves. And essentially, that is providing the ability to procure additional capacity either above or below what typically is used. The way we determine how to procure and whether it's more or less, we take a look at the forecast for the coming day, as well as historical information that we have on that area. And we also wrap in wind, solar, and load forecasts. Essentially, if we take a look at an area in a particular hour, and if the trend, the analysis shows that that area tends to need more energy in real time than is secured in day ahead, they'll have this imbalance reserve up product that will be, that requirement will have for that hour. If there's certain hours of the day where they tend to need less than what is procured in day ahead, there will be this kind of cushion for imbalance reserves down. The procurement of this product is done at the entire entity level, but at the individual level, the way it works out is different bidding requirements for those resources that receive an award for these products. So the way that works is the IFM manage those energy schedules and optimizes the transfers between BAs. And there is this concept of making sure that resources have enough capability to adapt to what's happening from a demand perspective as we go through each hour of the day. So as we bring resources up and down to meet the current demand, these additional products provide extra wholesale market capacity and extra products to the West. It allows them to meet their net load uncertainty. So if you're taking a look at what that load need is compared to what it needs historically, you can kind of be able to tap into these flexible reserves, if you will. And it also allows these participating areas to not have to carry as much reserves as they would if they were on their own, if they're able to kind of tap into this wider pool. So that's where it maximizes the diversity benefit of having this large market footprint. Another product that's being added is something called reliability capacity up and down. And this is adjusting the way RUC works. And if you recall, when I talked about RUC, we said RUC today looks at tomorrow's forecast and procures additional capacity. In the future, the RUC is going to be adjusted so that it provides both upward and downward dispatch capability. So hourly at the balancing area level, but gets awarded at the individual resource level, they will have this capability to procure either additional capacity or give folks the opportunity to have a downward dispatch. And I've got a slide for you that will kind of visually show that. Maybe I have about 2 or 3 more minutes and then we're going to go on a tour. So I'm trying to respect the timing here. So reliability capacity bids come from across the entire market footprint, just like it would for imbalance reserves. If you take a look at this chart here, if you recall, RUC takes a look at the demand forecast compared to what physically cleared. So if we've got this shape here of the physical supply that cleared the market, we compare it to the forecast for the coming day. If the forecast is higher than what was procured in those particular hours, then we would procure reliability capacity up for that area. So make sure we bridge that gap so that what was forecasted is covered through the market. An element that RUC does not have today, which is this other product, is reliability capacity down. If we take a look at the demand forecast for the coming day, which is that blue line, and you see how the demand forecast is lower than that green piece, which is where the market cleared, we would procure reliability capacity down in those hours where there's a lower demand forecast for that particular area. And I know that was like a super fast flyover. We can talk a little bit about more of that later. But some other changes coming with EDAM, all loads and resources in EDAM will be submitting offers, both economic or self-schedule. We won't have any more of something called a non-participating resource, which would be a resource that only submits a base schedule but does not participate economically. We're also going to be settling all of those day-ahead transactions. In WEIM today, there is no day-ahead market transaction, so there's no day-ahead market settlement. So of course, when we open up the day-ahead market, we'll have settlement of day-ahead market activity. What stays the same is, again, entities retain their resource planning, transmission planning, and reliability functions. So the way both EDAM and DAME together will provide benefits to WEIM is those economic benefits through the commitment of least cost generation, improved situational awareness across BAs, enhanced reliability, and lower overall greenhouse gas emissions. These changes will be coming in spring of 2026, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up and take a pause here. We'll handle questions later after the tour, but I thank you so much for letting me just indulge for a few minutes and give you that quick flyover. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording.
All right. Thank you so much, Radha. Really appreciate that. And as Radha mentioned, she'll be